So what you're looking at here are a series of photographs I came across on eBay. Images that directly relate to what I'll be working on in the upcoming videos. This is a project I originally built back in 2010 using the TriStar kit. I've always had a strong interest in these early training vehicles, as well as the Panzer command and support wagons that Germany fielded at the beginning of the war. They're often overlooked subjects, but they're packed with mechanical detail, which has always drawn me in. Before us is the Panzerkampfwagen 1 Ausführung A, shown here in a form that speaks directly to its original purpose, a training vehicle. This example represents a Panzer I ohne Aufbau without its superstructure, a configuration commonly used for instruction, mechanical familiarization, and driver training during the early years of German rearmament. As I was digging through my old archives, I rediscovered these photos from that original build. Even though they're from a different era of my modeling, I thought they were still worth sharing. These are simple sprue shots, but they clearly show just how far ahead the TriStar kit was compared to the Panzer I kits that came out before it. I distinctly remember building one of the older Panzer I kits years earlier, and the difference was night and day. In terms of interior detail and overall fidelity, the TriStar kit was light years ahead. Here we are looking at the transmission and the steering brake assemblies. The wooden box you see is something I had made while I was working on a television show. Completely unnecessary, but somehow fitting when you're dealing with highly detailed resin parts like these. The aftermarket set is from Aber, and it includes 2 sheets of Photo-Etch along with these distinctive pink resin components. These are the resin transmission parts, and the cleanup on them was fairly straightforward. When you compare them to the kit-supplied parts, it's clear that the resin offers a more accurate representation of the real components. Some Photo-Etch is added to refine the details even further. To do that, I had to drill out a few areas to accept the metal parts. In the early 1930s, Germany did not yet need a battlefield tank. It needed experience. The Panzer I was designed as a learning platform, a way to rebuild armored knowledge that had been lost since the First World War. Crews learned how to drive tracked vehicles, operate transmissions, maintain engines, and function as a team inside a confined machine long before heavier tanks ever appeared. And here you can see just how tiny some of these pieces really are as they come off the fret. To make handling easier, I often use a Photo-Etch folding tool to hold the part while trimming away the attachment points. After that, a fine file is used to clean everything up and make sure the edges are perfectly smooth. Once bent into shape, the finished piece is ready to be installed.
You can see here that linkage part B45 of the Photo-Etch has been bent into a shallow U shape. What I'm doing is feeding some stretched plastic sprue through the holes in this part and B88. I stretch the sprue using a candle, and once it's threaded through, I use a lit incense stick to gently apply heat. The incense gives just the right amount of warmth to soften the plastic without melting it. The sprue recoils slightly from the heat and rounds itself off, which gives a very convincing rivet head. With that done, we move on to the upper transmission area. The sub-assemblies, which is basically up to you to create, that fit into part B82A, make contact with B88 and B45 and B82B. Here you can see a couple of resin parts that need to be removed from their casting blocks and added to the brake assemblies. I'm adding the part that sits underneath the brake drums, and this needs to be installed on both sides. These pieces are there to carry part of the linkage system. You can see me shaping B85B, a thin strip of metal, into a small donut, essentially a short tube or cylinder. I form it around a steel rod from my punch set and then solder it closed, and once that's cleaned up, it gets added to the parts 85A and 85B. How I do that is I add a small nib of solder and then place the part on top of that and solder these two parts together. I've drilled out two holes here on the underside of the two brake drums. Those parts are secured with cyanocrylate or CA glue. At this stage, I'm also experimenting with different materials to work out the linkage, trying plastic rod first, then deciding instead to use a piece of a paper clip. I soldered a small Photo-Etch lever onto the end of that. Unfortunately, these build photos I have are pretty low resolution, but hopefully you can still get the idea of what's going on. I added a small white plastic disc to the end of that linkage and at this point I'm still testing different approaches to see what looks right. It's worth mentioning that this build dates back to 2010, so some of the decisions I made back then aren't entirely clear to me now. For example, you'll see part of the hull being worked on here, but I believe I eventually swapped it out for a later version. I'm pointing out the 45-degree angle on the sidewall bulkhead and the tank tub deck, which is a distinctive feature of this hull. This is where the parts go together. Here you can see additional resin components that make up the final drive and braking system. I suspect that what happened is that I progressed a bit further with this version of the hull before deciding to switch. There were several Panzer I Auf A kits released by TriStar, and the later versions show noticeable improvements, especially in the bogie wheels, which have more parts and better detail. I'll show the different instruction sheets I downloaded from ScaleMates later on. What I'm doing here is creating the linkage using brass rod. Two photo-etch parts have been bent into U-shapes and the linkage connects underneath them. The same process is repeated on the right-hand side.
Next, we'll focus on the Photo-Etch fenders from Aber. After cutting the support bracket part off the PE fret, I take the opportunity, before folding it into shape, to indent the spots that are meant to represent rivets. To do this, I'm using a metal tool from my old etching and printmaking days, which turns out to be absolutely perfect for this job. Aber sets also come with a small piece of cardboard that works really well to place under the metal parts when making these indentations. In this case, I'm using a piece of MDF, which is exactly the right amount of give for this kind of work. Once that's done, we can use the old Mission Models PE folding tool to form the angle stiffener that supports the extruded tread plate on the fender. Here I'm using a lighter to anneal the tread plate, which makes the metal a lot more malleable. After that, I clean off the black oxide from the heat with a bit of sandpaper. This tool here is an old dry transfer burnishing tool from the days of Letraset. Anyone remember that stuff? Yeah, I'm that old. There was a bit of a convex bow in this tread plate. So after annealing, I was able to use that tool to gently work it flat and smooth everything out. My approach to soldering this is pretty straightforward. I'll often pre-solder one of the parts by tinning it first. Then, when it's time to attach the second piece, I just apply a bit of flux and add heat, letting the solder flow and do the work. Here's a quick comparison. On the left is the kit transmission straight out of the box, and on the right is the same part with the Photo-Etch added. The overall shape is the same, but the PE straps and hardware really sharpen things up and make it look much more like a real mechanical assembly instead of a solid lump of plastic. It's one of those details you might not notice right away, but once it's painted and weathered, it makes a big difference. This is one side of the lower hull tub,
and my plan is to drill a hole that lines up with the one in the metal support and pin it with a bit of wire. That gives the whole thing some real strength, instead of just trusting glue. From here, I continue soldering the tread plate into position, working along the joint and letting the solder flow. This small piece is added to the tread plate right at the front edge. It acts as a locating and reinforcing tab, tying the tread plate into the curved portion of the fender. Once it's soldered in place, it helps lock the tread plate to the front mudguard section, giving that curved area a solid mechanical connection. This is the clip and clasp for the removable front fender, which is something you'll often see missing in period photos of the real vehicle. These are just some quick comparison shots of the Voyager Photo-Etch. It's fine, but in my opinion, the Aber parts are the stronger option here. Next, we'll move on and do a bit more work on the hull, starting with the front transmission cover from the kit. Like I've said before, it's been a long time since I originally worked on this area, but what I think was happening here is that after test fitting the transmission, the plastic cover needed to be thinned down to get everything to sit properly. It did fit after that, but I eventually decided to go with the Photo-Etch replacement instead, most likely after comparing it to scale drawings from Panzer tracks. Here you can see I've added some filler putty to the inside of the hull. So, next up, what I think I'm doing here is starting work with the Photo-Etch set for the Panzer I Alsace engine cover area, as well as the rear of the hull. I'm not sure what's going on here. I think what I'm going to do here is I was going to use the metal circular part, but that didn't work out. So I'm going to try using this Photo-Etch part instead and see how far I get with it. I don't know, things haven't been really going my way on this build, have they? In any case, let's take a look. Now a bit of foreshadowing here. As you'll see later on, I actually ended up not using this whole setup. I've left it in the video anyway, mainly as an exercise to show how this work is done. Further down the line, I'll end up selectively using some of these parts, surgically implanting them into the plastic instead. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I went ahead with it exactly this way at the time, because I clearly changed direction midstream. That might be because the rear end wasn't quite right for this particular version of the Panzer I, or possibly because I ran into some fit issues. I'm really not certain.
Of all the photo etch companies out there, I feel in my experience that Aber hinges are the most strong ones, they're the most useful ones, and I think they're also the most accurate ones. So that's my recommendation. If you want to do photo etch, I would recommend Aber Photo Etch. There's a lot of other companies out there, but I find that their photo etch is either too thin or too, I don't know, just not as robust. So these hinges I'm making are for the engine access hatches that are on the rear of the Panzer 1 engine deck. And they are functional, but I wouldn't recommend popping them open all the time because they are somewhat fragile. You get metal fatigue if you do it too many times. There are differences in the engine deck with the different versions of the Panzer 1, especially around the number of fuel filler ports and stuff like that, so that may well have been part of this decision. Either way, let's treat this as a useful exercise, something for you guys to watch and enjoy, and we'll get properly back on track a little further down the line.
Once that's taken care of, we can move on to the bulkhead that separates the fighting compartment from the engine compartment. In this shot, you can see the aftermarket parts that make up the bulkhead, along with some of the Photo-Etch that will be folded up into the various storage boxes that sit inside the lower hull. These parts here are used to mount the transmission to the lower hull and to the front of the hull. Here you can see I've replaced the resin cast parts that were meant to represent the torsion bar suspension with plastic rod of the appropriate diameter. I find this gives a much more consistent look and is easier to work with. I also use a file to open up the mounting points slightly so everything lines up properly. I'm honestly not sure what was going on with these metal parts here, because in the end I didn't use them. They just didn't seem to work properly for mounting the transmission, and I can't quite remember what the issue was. Sorry about that. Next up, I do some test fitting to make sure everything works together before any paint goes on. For this, I often use a temporary cement that's basically a latex. It lets me check the fit without committing to anything, and everything can be pulled apart again easily for painting as sub-assemblies and final installation later on. Here you can see some of the other parts coming together, including the tunnel for the drive shaft and another torsion bar. With the transmission wrapped up for now, we'll turn our attentions to the floor of the vehicle. So we'll solder up the support frame and then solder on the floor plate. Here you can see I've already painted the underside of the plastic engine cover. Next, the parts are test fitted, which is something we'll be doing several times as we go along. Okay, here you can see that I'm putting together the batteries, and these are Photo-Etch parts themselves. And I'm also building a larger storage box. I'm not sure exactly what will be in there. But these are all made from the Photo-Etch set, and just have to make sure they fit.
Okay, I think these pictures are of the other Panzer 1A that I was working on here. I can't be sure, but that's what I suspect. This one's got the full interior as well. Anyways, I think at this point, I'm just going to stop doing any narration because this is starting to drive me crazy trying to get everything lined up. So I'm just going to end up writing everything in the frame of the picture that you're looking at, and hopefully you'll get the idea, or you can ask me questions down below in the comments. Yeah, so I'm just gonna be writing captions for what's going on, and yeah, in the name of sanity I have to move on.